welcome back to you. Meryl's been to the festival before, and like most nonfiction writers who do incredibly great research, she's a few years between books, which is to be expected, meticulous. And also, she comes here, I have to take a few seconds to say, on the laurels of an avalanche of reviews. This book has only been out 1 month, and just have to tell you, rave reviews, in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, Airmail, Graydon Carter's online thing, the Daily Beast. You are Amazon's #1 pick for biography. Yeah, it's worth it. Save your applause for the rest of the list. Town and Country called The Woman Who Knew Everyone a must-read of 2025. You had an interview on the CBS Sunday Morning Show, which is just, everybody watches, it's great. You started your first day with a podcast with the great Anne Lamott that you can pull up and read anywhere. Did something happen on the Today Show too? Someone?
Nope.
No, okay. Someone said something. And there is a quote from a guy you may have run across here, the hugely well-respected John Meacham, who said, "This is an absorbing and illuminating portrait of a lost world." So if you haven't bought it, go to the bookstore the minute you leave here before leaving the campus and get a copy. So you spoke with the wonderful Elizabeth Sorensen 2 hours ago about the Bunny Mellon book. I would love you to start by just telling us about your professional career, because when I first knew you, met you, heard of you, you were a really well-regarded journalist.
I began as well, first, thank you all for coming. And thank you all for staying for this last
Can't hear
hour
you.
or so.
Is her...
Really appreciate it. And Linda and I have been friends for a really long time, so it's really fun for me to be with my friend up here, and my very supportive friend who told me where to get clothes for my book tour. I mean, you know. And we don't have the same clothes, which is really impressive. I began as a journalist, and first in the newspaper in Cincinnati Post, Rochester Democrat and Chronicle, then in Washington. I covered crime and I covered economics. And I never thought I would end up writing, and then I ended up writing for a lot of magazines, did a lot of celebrity cover stories, and I never thought I'd end up writing about these very wealthy women who were all born turn of the century and didn't have the kind of opportunities that we all have now. So this really, my first book was about Brooke Astor. You remember? And
how did you come to write that? Because that's when I first saw you hanging around the courthouse. My turn.
Covered the courthouse. As you may remember, Brooke Astor's grandson sued his father for control of Brooke's assets, saying that she'd been elder abused. I had been asked to do a story about her for New York Magazine about a year earlier, just because she was always in the New York Times Sunday columns, the photo columns, and she had kind of vanished. So I did a number of interviews at that point, and I was freelance, and there was a point where I really couldn't quite figure out what I had. I did interview her son, which ended up being important, and his wife. It was a weird interview because every time I asked a question, he would be tense, the dog would start barking, and I thought, this is weird. And his wife would say, well, he doesn't want to talk about that. And I'm thinking, he could tell me himself. But anyhow, making this long story way too long, I put it aside. I didn't really think anything would come of it, but I'm normally disorganized, and that time I wrote down all the phone numbers, everyone I tried to reach. I had a whole box. So my husband and I were leaving for Martha's Vineyard, and I opened the front door, and there was a big front page headline, "Disaster for Mrs. Astor." And that's when her grandson had sued his father. And New York Magazine was down that day, so my husband and I got in the car, drove to Martha's Vineyard. We were on the ferry docking, and I got a call from New York Magazine, "We want the story." I was in the wrong place. So I was in this little house in the woods without Wi-Fi, but I had my list of all the people I had called, and I called everyone again, and I was able to get her grandson to speak to me and Lord Astor. I discovered where every rich person on the Upper East Side summered. They answered the phone. So I did this story, and I literally turned it in on a Friday, and my husband and I were walking on the beach, and I said, how does a family like this fall apart in public? I bet there's more. So I said to my agent, and I'd had many book proposals that nobody wanted. I said, you know, do you think there'd be interest? She said, let me find out. I flew back to New York. I put on my pearls, and my silk dress. I met with all these publishers. And because I didn't think it would happen, I don't know about the rest of you, if I really want something, I'm so nervous. But this time I was like, it won't happen. I can, you know, I'll do this, I'll do that. I take off my, you know, pearls, my nice dress. I put my jeans on. I go to the airport. My agent calls and says, there's a bidding war.
For the book.
And I have to say, in the beginning, I went directly to the fetal position. I've never written a book. I can't write a book. This is a terrible thing to do. And then I realized that Brooke Astor, you know, was out every night. And if I called her favorite charities, I might be able to go because I was New York Magazine. So I went, and all these people who wouldn't return my phone calls, you know, Tom Brokaw was there, Mike Wallace was there, many famous people. And looking at me in my evening gown and my pearls, they talked to me. So I ended up having a book.
It's a great book, as is the next one, The Phantom of Fifth Avenue. I'm moving past that.
Good.
Buy it. And Bunny Mellon, just a fabulous read. Buy it. And I'm moving on to Perle Mesta, The Woman of This Moment, with the brand new, wonderful book. And I was an adolescent in the late 50s, and very middle class. So when my mother would give a dinner party, she would put on a small strand of pearls and a silk dress, and that's the way she would go to her friends' dinner parties. And I'm saying all this because the next day, the phone calls would always be, oh, you were the hostess with the mostest. And that was a phrase I grew up hearing as a 10, 11, 12-year-old. Never knew the origin, just thought it was idiomatic and had been around forever. And learned, finally, reading Meryl's book, that Irving Berlin, the great songwriter, coined that phrase for a Broadway show, a fictional version of Perle Mesta's life. So Perle Mesta was the hostess with the mostest, which is an amazing way to be self-made, in a sense, and have a life. So now, back to you. How did you come to discover Perle Mesta and decide to devote a book to her?
I had spent a lot of time in Washington for a number of years, and I started reading society gossip columns when I was a teenager. I just thought it was fun. I grew up in Rochester, New York, nice Jewish suburb. This was a world beyond my imagination. All these rich people going here, there, and Perle Mesta was always in these columns. And I'd heard about her for many years, but again, you know, she had faded out of the spotlight. And then there's a theater in New York called City Center that has an ongoing series called Encores. And they brought back Call Me Madam, which was the Irving Berlin show. And I was looking for a book, and a friend of mine said, what about Perle Mesta? And I'm literally typing into the, you know, and I discovered there had never been a biography of her. It was one of those things where I have been totally astonished by the attention this book has gotten. And I think it's because, you know, I didn't think anybody would be interested in a famous woman who died in 1975. And therefore, you know, most people had never heard of her. But I think she's hit the moment. I think there's a lot of nostalgia for the way that Washington used to be. And Perle, among many things, was famous for entertaining both Republicans and Democrats at her house, trying to get them to work together. She was a major force for women's rights, a quiet but effective force for civil rights. She was only the third woman appointed to a State Department foreign post. So I think that, you know, and she was born in 1882. Women didn't get the right to vote till 1920, sorry. But just think about her life, spread it out over enormous. The one thing that was much harder about this book than the others, for my Brooke Astor book, I traipsed, and Bunny Mellon as well, I traipsed all over to, you know, Annette de Laurentia's home, and every famous person's home, and interviewed Barbara Walters, and all these other people. And Bunny Mellon, I interviewed as Givenchy. But Perle Mesta died in 1975, so most of her contemporaries were long gone. I was able to interview LBJ's two daughters, they were kids, but they knew her and remembered her fondly. Susan Eisenhower, I met at this festival a number of years ago. She spoke with me. A number of society reporters in Washington some of them in their 80s and 90s who had covered Pearl, you know. And it was archival research mostly. I spent a lot of time at the Truman Presidential Library and the Eisenhower Presidential Library and the LBJ website. So it was a different kind of book in many ways. I am incredibly lucky that Pearl, two things. Pearl loved publicity. I mean, she gave so many interviews that was really fabulous. And Time magazine in 1949 thought that Pearl was so significant that they actually, we'll show you later, they put her on the cover. She was doing a lot of entertaining for Harry Truman. She had helped him save his 1948 campaign, which I can come back to.
You will come back to when I ask that question.
So just
fascinating.
All right, well, let me just finish this one part. But anyhow, Time magazine back in the day sent reporters all over. So they sent them to Michigan, where she was born, to Texas, where she had her early days, Oklahoma City, Newport. They interviewed all the famous hostesses in Washington who were incredibly jealous and had nasty feuds. And all this material Time magazine donated it to the New York Historical Society. There's 150 pages on Perle Mesta there. So, and most of which had never seen the light of day. So that was really enormously helpful to me in understanding her and figuring out her world and her life.
Well done. So take us back. People associate her with Oklahoma because that's where her father built the largest hotel. But she wasn't born there. Take us, if you would, from that point on, from Oklahoma and the Skirvin Hotel.
All right. Let me show one or two pictures to go with this. And this is Pearl in her heyday. The Paris gowns, the whole glamour thing. This is little Pearl, and Pearl with her mother. Her father was a farm implement salesman from Michigan who lived out the cliche. He married the farmer's daughter. And he was always seeking opportunities. He went to the Oklahoma land rush and picked up some real estate. Then he went down to Galveston, Texas, and he created a whole new little town outside of Galveston. And Pearl was born in Michigan. Her mother was visiting her in-laws, but essentially spent most of her formative years in Texas. In 1906, Oklahoma was about to have statehood, and her father moved him. He made his first fortune in real estate, his second as an oil wildcatter, and then went to Oklahoma City to seek his fortune. And that's Dad. His William Skirvin, Skirvin, and Pearl was born Pearl. And later, as an adult, she decided that Pearl, Perle, was more sophisticated, so she changed it. Her father built the largest hotel in Oklahoma City, the Skirvin. It's really still quite extraordinary. Early years, in my last, when I talked about Bunny and her gorgeous younger sister, Pearl also had a gorgeous younger sister. Now this is Marguerite, and Pearl had her own ambitions, but Marguerite, as a teenager, suddenly became a great sensation as an actress both on Broadway and silent movies. And their father had a great idea of who should be Marguerite's chaperone, Pearl. So what I've always been intrigued by, Pearl wrote an autobiography, and she never mentions the several years in which she was crisscrossing the country with her kid sister, standing in the wings while her sister took her bows. No sibling rivalry here, although they became very close. After Marguerite was kind of launched in life, she was 22, Pearl moved to New York. She was then in her early 30s. And she had wanted to be an opera singer. Her parents had sent her to the Sherwood Academy in Chicago. She realized that she didn't really have the voice. So there she is in New York, and she's introduced to this very handsome man, George Mesta. George was from Pittsburgh. He was visiting the city, son of Italian immigrants, scholarship student at college, had started this engineering firm, Mesta Machine, which became this enormous, employed 3,000 people, made power turbine engines. So he and Pearl met, they fell in love, they got married, but she had never been to Pittsburgh, and he had never really been to Oklahoma City. And when she went to Pittsburgh, she had a terrible time. The local society thought she was kind of this hick, and they didn't accept her. And she played the piano, she waited for her husband to come home. He had this gorgeous mansion, but it was right in a bluff overlooking all of his facilities with the smoke pouring up. It was, think of urban pollution. And then her life was changed by World War I. Her husband became an advisor to Woodrow Wilson. Suddenly, she's spending time in Washington, and she's discovering, among other things, that there was a big disparity. I think this is different now, but at that point, a lot of very influential civil servants who didn't have any money. And Perle discovered they took a suite at the Willard Hotel. Her next door neighbor was the vice president Marshall. The Marshalls had no money, but he was a vice president. Perle discovered that if you, bought tickets at charity balls and various things and invited all these underfunded, influential people, you could make a lot of very good friends. Now, do you want to stop for a minute, or do you want to keep going?
Yeah, take a breath for a minute. Okay, so you've gone over exactly the high points of her life up to that period. Tell us, as you do in the book, when Perle was relieved of being the chaperone to the beautiful Marguerite and moved to New York. She moved there, she was given a very generous allowance by her father.
Yes.
Right? And one of the things you do so well is when there's a dollar sign put on something in 1906, Meryl tells us what it would be, how many millions it would be worth today. So you get a real sense of this young woman, it's probably for me, this young woman living really well. And then she marries George Mesta, who's about 20 years older than she.
Yeah.
One of the things you do in this book is tell us that for years, Perle lied about her age, right? And by a good 8 years.
She lied. She even lied when she was confirmed to be a foreign service. There was something about, she always said she was younger than she was. And in fact, when you look at the obituaries, all the obituaries have different dates. I found out because there were census reports. So you could find, her parents, she was 2 years old in X year, she was X years old in Y year, and I decided I would believe the census.
Right. So, but do you have any, and it was a big gap, though. It was as much.
It was 20 years, yeah.
But in her lies, as much as 8 years,
yeah.
She took off her life. And I don't know when it caught up to her. She died at the age of 92. I don't know if she was 84 or 120, but it's just following it through as you did. It was just a really interesting fact about her that I'd never seen anywhere else that you do bring out. So in 17, the United States declares war on Germany, and that's when George Mesta's role becomes more important, and they're in D.C. So again, you describe society there, that the people who'd been there for generations and had power in Washington for generations and money were known as cave dwellers.
And still, even now, that phrase is used sometimes in Washington. Yeah.
And then different layers of people, and Perle would have been nouveau riche. She would have been just arrived from with George, and they were kind of both regarded as hicks, I would think, in Washington for high society. And this is a woman who was determined to make an impression and make a life because she had the money to do it. And as you say, born when she was, there weren't a lot of ways women did it professionally. She decided to do it in this social milieu. Mm-hmm. And so tell us how long roughly they stayed in Washington then, and what happened when she went back to Pittsburgh.
She never really went back to Pittsburgh. After World War II ended, her husband began building a gorgeous house in Pittsburgh. She was lobbying for Washington. But during that period, his business opportunities overseas exploded because many companies wanted to export his machines. So they did 22 trips to Europe. And she really loved those trips and, dancing in the high seas. And I think they were a very happy marriage. They wanted to have children. It didn't happen for them. They thought about adopting. Her husband wanted to see if it would still happen for them. And then in 1925, they were on a trip to New York, and he had a business meeting. It was canceled. They went to the dinner. They went to the theater. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, she woke up, and he said, "I don't feel well." And he was dead a few minutes later of a heart attack. Okay. So suddenly she is a widow, and she's very rich. And she did two interesting things at that point. Her husband had structured his will so that she was going to get interest income, but she wasn't going to get, he'd given her a huge chunk of stock worth, I cannot tell you how much time I spent trying to figure out how much money she had. It was at least $18 million then, it was a lot of money. But the way the will was structured, she was going to have to live off interest income, and then the stock would go to his family when she died. And she rebelled against that. There was another option. She could take half the stock now, which she just opted to do. And she insisted, and we're looking at 1925, and being put on her husband's board of directors, which is very rare for women. But she hightailed it out of Pittsburgh back to Washington as soon as she could, because Washington, they'd been happy there, they'd had friends, she'd begun to develop a world, and so back to Washington.
And she was basically, at that point in her life, in her early 40s, a Republican.
Her father was Republican, her husband was Republican, she was Republican.
The other place she went, we'll get back to Washington, where it would seem unlikely in this day and age you could break into a social structure, was Newport, Rhode Island, where grand homes, mansions, Vanderbilts and all, people for generations who had had wealth. But she took herself to Newport as a widow, bought a home, and did sort of the same party thing.
She did. Her sister at that point had left the stage, gotten married. Forgive me. So almost for the rest of their lives, the sisters did a lot of things together. Her sister would later remarry, but her sister had 3 children, and the 2 women went to Newport, and they had made friends at the opera, one of the Vanderbilts. And if you knew one Vanderbilt, you got to know all the other Vanderbilts. So they were invited, and they began to invite other people, and they rented the Wright Cottage. We all know what to do now. If you want to social climb, and you have money, there are lots of ways of making a lot of new friends. And Perle did that. Cleveland Amory did this famous book called Who Killed Society? He listed Perle as one of the people who did, because he kind of couldn't believe her rise from this, Oklahoma, Texas gal to suddenly she's in high society. But she did that, and she was suddenly invited to all the best homes and having her own parties, and she had a beautiful place. I drove past it about 18 months ago in Newport.
So the other thing, Perle then, shortly thereafter, became known as Two-Party Perle. It was one of her nicknames, because of her relationship that she developed with Harry and Bess Truman. And if you tell us how that started, because I do want to get to the fabulous train story that I'd never seen in any history.
In 1939, Perle, it was like she woke up out of a slumber. She'd been having this very nice life and spending her husband's money and summering here and there, but she really wanted a cause. She wanted something that would be meaningful, and she became an ardent feminist for the Equal Rights Amendment. And it was like one day it was like she woke up and suddenly this would be the cause for the rest of her life. And one of the things that Perle was incredibly good at was making friends with people very early in their career. After her husband died and she was in Washington, her uncle asked her to give a party for a family friend who was marrying a man named Milton Eisenhower, younger brother of Ike. So Perle met Ike and Mamie when Ike was a major. And in 1939, Perle began doing lobbying for the Equal Rights Amendment in Washington. And she met this Missouri senator, Harry Truman, and he liked her. And they became very good friends. And when she went to the 1940 Republican convention. She was a Wilkie fan. She managed to get the Republicans to put the Equal Rights Amendment in the party platform. She kind of knew all of those men. She was like 5-state Perle at this point, Michigan, Oklahoma, Rhode Island. And it was a huge furor. It was amazing to see this New York Times, headline saying, Republican, some women aghast, ERA and platform, So she did that, but she was upset about how the Republicans treated Woodrow, Wilkie. And essentially at that point she became a Democrat. And she went to the Democratic convention. She was really big on, Truman becoming FDR's vice president. So shortly after Truman was sworn in, she gave him a party at the Sulgrave Club in Washington. And this was, it's a very fancy club. I got to speak there last week. They gave me Pearl's room. Oh my God. It wasn't as big as this room, but it was close. The chandelier, the fireplace, Anyhow, Truman had such a good time at that party that he stayed and played the piano and was there till 1 in the morning. 6 weeks later, FDR is dead. Truman is the president. Bess Truman doesn't like to entertain. Perle Mesta is the hottest ticket in town. She rents a glorious mansion. She also becomes very close to Bess Truman and Bess and Harry's daughter, Margaret. Now, I'm talking Elon Musk and Donald Trump close. I mean, inseparable. If Bess went somewhere, Pearl went too. And so the family was very close, and Pearl is in and out of the White House. Pearl is also beginning dinner parties, and she tries to fix up Margaret Truman with this very dashing new Massachusetts congressman, JFK. and in the Truman library, they have Margaret's diaries. And it's sort of so adorable to read, Pearl took me to meet, or I have the flu, but I'm getting up anyhow because, John Kennedy's going to be at the dinner party. It didn't take, obviously. In 1948, Truman's campaign was, no one thought he could possibly win. I'm sure you all remember the famous headline, Dewey beats Truman. Pollsters refused to, they really stopped, polling the race because everyone just assumed that Truman would lose. Pearl was in Newport when she got a phone call from the Truman campaign saying, could she come, and they were in Texas, could she come and help and raise money? She flies in, she gets on the train, she calls every rich person she knows, she rattles what I think of as the silver cup, not the tin cup.
And this is in Texas, she gets on the train
in Texas and into Oklahoma City, and she raises enough money to keep the Ferdinand Magellan, the train, rolling. And so a very grateful Harry Truman names Pearl to be ambassador. Let me show 1 or 2 slides, and then we'll go back to. I forgot this part. Pearl was so famous in the 1930s that everything she did made news. And she was, Charlie Curtis was Hoover's vice president, and she was his platonic date to everything. So he, in turn, arranged for her to be introduced at court to King George. And so this is Pearl in her glamour days. This is Pearl's arch rival in Washington, Gwen Kafritz. And while this is out of, Gwen and Pearl, they had this feud that went on for years, and it was hysterical. I mean, it was just because the colonists loved it. Gwen's husband was a Republican real estate guy, and she was very much of a snob, and she basically said, when Harry Truman was a senator, I never invited him to my parties because I thought he was boring. Who thought he could possibly be president? So Gwen's nose was out of joint. All right, 1 or 2. This is Bess and Harry Truman at one of the various events and dinners. This is the cover of Time magazine that I told you about earlier. One of the things that was kind of upsetting in reading both this and some of the coverage of Pearl, though I don't think the word fat shaming had been invented yet, but I cannot tell you how nasty. People talked about her being plump and large and this, and it was, she was always someone who tried to rise above the fray. She was Christian Scientist. She believed in the positive power of thinking, but it really hurt her. And, this referred to her as she needs to be corseted. This is Pearl, and with a hat on the left, the white hat, next to Bess Truman. And then there's the U.S. Treasurer, Georgia Nice. India Edwards, woman in black, was a very top official in the Democratic Party, and she was the one who really pushed Truman to nominate Pearl to the top job. And Pearl in Luxembourg. And when Pearl was in Luxembourg, Eisenhower had been named head of NATO. And essentially, Luxembourg, postage stamp-sized country, but it was strategically important because bordered with, France, Germany, and Belgium. But Ike really liked Pearl, so he kept going down there and spending weekends, and they would cook in the kitchen together, and he would paint. And she really thought that would, when, when Truman didn't run again and Ike won, she really thought that Ike would keep her on, but he didn't. Let me see, one or two more pictures. Perle with Margaret Truman, and Margaret visited her there. So back to you.
Okay, thank you. The Luxembourg piece stories in your book are among my favorites. And a reviewer recently, one of these great reviews, described the delectable detail with which Meryl tells a story. And you see, she is not only a brilliant researcher, which you are, but that rare combination, also a great storyteller. I mean, here's this woman, who's heard of her, probably some people in this room, but it's such an interesting life, so well told, with all the details to back it up. So she's appointed to Luxembourg. One little thing, she was never the ambassador, she was the minister. And I think you said because she couldn't lie to the Senate about her age.
That was
in part, right?
That was part of it, but a lot of it was, that was the point where embassies had to be reciprocal. And so, Luxembourg didn't have an embassy in America. It was the size of the country. The person who came afterward was made an ambassador, and she was kind of annoyed by that whole phenomena. Perle did two things in Luxembourg that I wanted to mention that you were probably going to bring up. She brought her sister with her, and they drove all over the country, and she wanted to be a different kind of ambassador. She didn't want to just hang out with the foreign policy set. So she drove through small towns, she met mayors. She discovered that many of the mayors didn't know each other, so she began a yearly party at the residence so they could meet each other. She also went to an orphanage, and again, this is a woman who loved parties, and again, it's right after World War II. There were a tremendous number of orphans in the country. Perle decided to give an annual party for orphans, and it made her hugely popular. And the other thing she did, which was unusual, one day 3 American GIs knocked on the door of the residence saying they had bet one another they couldn't meet Perle. And she invited them in, they stayed for dinner. Her sister Marguerite told her the next day that they said they were homesick. So Perle decided that once a month that she would give a party for GIs. They came, she had music, she had food, and she would write letters home to their mothers. I don't think she understood what she was getting into. By the end of it, she was renting halls. She said she entertained 25,000 GIs. They were coming from all over Europe. And people later showed up in her life showing these letters that had meant so much.
So that's, yes, those are the stories I wanted to mention, and a little more. You taught me so much history. I thought I knew a lot about World War II, the Battle of the Bulge, of course, which I always connect to France and Belgium, forgetting that it was also
fought in Luxembourg.
In Luxembourg. And General Patton is buried in Luxembourg. So all these things that Perle was doing, the goodwill it brought, which is as Meryl said, I mean, it's not the ambassadorial role of making political decisions as much as she was creating such great goodwill for Americans. In that orphanage thing, she gave the party every year. She got presents for every one of the war orphans, is what they were. But there's a lovely, touching story about an African-American child, presumably an American soldier and a European woman. And Perle feared that this child would not be adopted in largely white Luxembourg. So what did she do?
She had heard from an American couple, African-American, who were looking to adopt, and she helped cut through all the paperwork to make, and she stayed in touch with the family, and it was really, so many things I didn't know until I began the research. She stayed in touch, and when he was sworn in as a US citizen, she went to the ceremony. What I was going to say is, the challenge for me in writing this book, and if you read it, you'll let me know how I did, was really trying to meld her life up against the backdrop of American history, so you had context. And the first version of my book was a doorstop, because I was like so excited by everything I learned. And then we tried to cut it down to be manageable. But I felt like she lived against such an extraordinary backdrop of different worlds. Anyhow, I'll let you go.
Yes, and also the fact I love that her driver, the chauffeur taking her to Luxembourg the first time from Paris, got lost. They couldn't find Luxembourg. Right?
And you can imagine the headlines. I mean, an ambassador can't find her country.
So 1950, she learns that famous playwrights, Krauss and Lindsay, have planned to do a play, a Broadway show, called, or that eventually is called, Call Me Madam, Madam Ambassador, Madam Minister. And it's a fictional version of this big life. They don't call it Perle Mesta, but they hire a well-known belter named Ethel Merman to portray her on Broadway. Take it, please.
Pearl was really upset when she heard about this. And again, the show it came on really fast. I mean, they decided to do it in the summer of '49, literally as Pearl was on the boat going over. It was interesting to try to chart who was where when. But she really thought they'd make fun of her. They did. And she didn't know how this was going to play out. She came back on home leave at one point, and a famous Broadway columnist, Leonard Lyons, arranged to introduce her to Irving Berlin and Ethel Merman. She had a really good time with them, and they invited her to the opening. So she's sailing back, and the State Department sends her a cable telling her not to go, because they think this is going to be a laughingstock, and they don't think that it's appropriate for her to go. Well, this was the hottest show on Broadway. It broke every record. She wanted to go. So whenever Pearl really wanted anything in that era, which drove the State Department nuts, she went straight to the top. She went to Harry Truman. So she said, "Mr. President, I really want to see this show." He said, "Go ahead, take my wife and daughter." So she did, and essentially the song, Call Me Madam, followed her the rest of her life. She and Ethel Merman became incredibly close friends, and I've got a picture somewhere in here. I'm not quite sure where we are right now, so let me just
carry on.
Quick look. This is Pearl with Ike. And again, as I mentioned, her ability to make friends with people who were very useful. Sam Rayburn, Speaker of the House, had this protege, Lyndon Johnson, and Pearl. He was introduced to Pearl, and as his daughters told me, Pearl thought Daddy had potential, and she wanted to be part of that. So she introduced him to a lot of people, and Daddy didn't know many celebrities, and he was very grateful. So she really had an eye for picking future winners.
She had also an interview with a young inquiring camera reporter who came to her door, and she gave that interview. Tell us about that and their future relationship.
We're talking about Jackie Kennedy. Now, Pearl was friendly with Jackie's mother for many, many years, Janet Auchincloss, and they were friendly in Newport and in Washington. They spent time together, and right after Pearl was very upset when Ike wouldn't allow her to stay in Luxembourg, and she was headed home to eventually to Washington, and she stopped off in London because there was the big celebration of the Queen being sworn in. Pearl decided she would give the biggest, most elaborate party to make sure people still knew she was relevant. And Jackie was sent over to cover this party, and she wanted to go to Pearl's party. Jackie was going over to cover the events. So she knocked on Pearl's door and asked, "Can I come?" And the answer was, of course, yes. Right after this party, Pearl did an extraordinary thing. Stalin had just died, and the Russians decided to invite Perle Mesta, of all people, to come visit. There had been no Americans other than journalists who were assigned. Not only did she go to Russia, but they at that point they wouldn't allow anyone to get out of Moscow. Her husband's plant had supplied Russia with various. She was allowed to travel all over the country, and then she wrote a series that appeared, syndicated in the newspapers. So she was, in addition to everything else, she was an ambassador. She was a columnist, and. Do you want me to go to Jackie?
Well, Jackie, because we're
running down on time.
You're going to have to read the book, but this is a woman who was really close to Harry Truman, to President Eisenhower, to Lyndon Johnson, and then Jack Kennedy's elected.
Pearl, as you may remember, although I didn't, I have to say, Lyndon Johnson did not run in the 1960 primaries. He was really hoping that at the convention in Los Angeles, there would be a deadlock and he would break through. Perle was big for LBJ. She gave a 5,000-person breakfast in Los Angeles. As you may remember, John Kennedy got the nod. Perle was in Johnson's suite when he came out and told all his friends he had agreed to accept the vice president slot. Perle went kind of nuts. There's a whole lot of things in the LBJ library, oral histories. She was pulling on LBJ's tie, saying, "You betrayed us. How could you do this?" Now, normally, you would have thought she would have quieted down, supported the ticket. She went on to the Republican presidential convention in Chicago, where they nominated Richard Nixon. And Perle, at that point, she could have patched up her relationship with the Kennedys. She had made the kind of public criticisms that Johnson had made, that Kennedy was too young or too ambitious, or his father was trying to buy the election. She gave this completely disastrous interview to the Associated Press. And I think that was a period where Jackie and Jack were in Cape Cod, and they were relaxed, and Jackie had her hair in a bandana and was wearing pedal pushers. So Perle gave this interview and said she was really concerned about Jackie and whether Jackie would be able to handle the White House because, oh my God, she didn't wear stockings. And she didn't want this clan in the White House that would have people like Frank Sinatra visiting. And the Kennedys, as you can imagine, had a fairly long memory, so that, show of hands, how many of you think that Perle Mesta ever went to the White House while Jack and Jackie were there? Yes, you're all right. She was never invited. It made her crazy. She was kind of, excuse me, she kept saying nice things about Jackie in the press. It didn't matter. But as soon as LBJ was in the White House, within the first week, you can see that he called Perle, and she was at the very first state dinner, and she was at state dinners for the rest of the Johnson era.
So 2 quick things. A very smart audience member came up to Meryl before we started to say, well, how come Jackie's on the book cover with Perle when they really didn't maintain a relationship? And
well, first thing, this is the first picture you'll ever see that Jack Kennedy was cropped out of the picture because he was too far to the... essentially, they did eventually have a rapprochement, but what sells books? You put Jackie Kennedy on the cover,
right?
You're going to sell some books.
Thank you for your question before. That helped. Now, on a personal note, I wanted to get you something for your birthday, which was just a week ago. And so I wanted actually also to go vintage clothes shopping in Palm Springs. We went, my husband was very patient. The cab driver let us out two miles away from where I would have been. But this is serendipity. I didn't get to buy anything for myself, but out in front of a store were 2 buckets of vinyl records of Broadway musicals of the 50s and 60s. And what are the odds of finding Call Me Madam?
Thank you.
With the Hostess and the Mostest. And I hope you don't already have a copy.
I don't.
So that's for your for your archives. And,
Thank you. And let me see if there's any. I think there's one or two more we haven't shown you. Perle and Mamie Eisenhower, Friends to the End. That's Perle with Ethel Merman, having a very good time. Perle with William Douglas, kind of people she would have to her parties. Perle with Lyndon Johnson at that 5,000-person breakfast. Perle went for Nixon. I'm a Democrat for Nixon in that race. And this is just Perle, the exuberant Perle.
And I have to say also, many of you knew or certainly read columns by Meryl's husband, Walter Shapiro, who died last year, who was, she'd known since college, and they had a long, great marriage, a wonderful writer. He went everywhere with her in support of the research of this book. They have a home in New York, Meryl's home still, that is the ultimate writer's home. I mean, there's more books, more political paraphernalia. It's just wangle an invitation if you can, because it's just, it is a one-of-a-kind New York apartment. And we miss him terribly, and the success of this book I know he's watching, but it's just, it's a joy to see you come out of this year with the stunning success of The Woman Who Knew Everyone, and I urge you to read it. We didn't even get through a fraction of the facts and the fun. It's great. It's a great book.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you all.